collection of results from some work we've been doing over the last 10 years at this point, related to modeling of interference. So this work has been done in collaboration with Laurent Clavier, who's a professor at IMT Lille, and several of PhD students that we've co-supervised. The starting point of this kind of investigation, well, we can start with the fact that when we're talking about modern wireless networks, they're often highly heterogeneous. So what this means is that we'll have many different types of users, and we may have different power levels, different access of frequency bands, different distances, and different lengths of packets, for example. So a good example of this kind of heterogeneity arises in a kind of network architecture which is being pushed over the last few years, particularly by a group at Aalborg, by Egan and Bardinelli. So this setting here is motivated by an emerging problem in 6G, which is trying to merge machine-type communications and ultra-reliable low-latency communications. So doing both of these things at the same time is quite difficult, because if you want to have low-latency communications and you have a large number of devices, then really you only have bandwidth to play with in order to try and allocate these resources. So in this case, we're inevitably going to have some kind of higher error probabilities, and as a consequence, this will lead to some violation of these properties. So one way of trying to mitigate some of these problems is to introduce some kinds of subnetworks. So what we have here, is it okay if this is the microphone? Do I need to be using this? Because it's just there's feedback from the speaker there. But in any case, so in these kinds of networks, what we have are several kinds of access points and some users that are associated with each of them. And so what we will typically have is this setting where a particular receiver will receive signals from the users that are associated with it. And there'll be several other subnetworks, and these subnetworks will effectively be treated as interference. So we'll have a lot of channel state information and a lot of control signaling within the subnetworks, but between them, this will be more lacking. So when we have this kind of setting, one of the key problems is interference. So in this case, we'll have, for example, devices which are outside one of these individual subnetworks. Their wireless signal, if they're using common bandwidth with devices that are allocated to this particular subnetwork, will be added to the received signal. And the consequences, and as a consequence, we will have this kind of interference, which we can think of as a kind of noise. So it's important to characterize this kind of interference for a few different reasons. So one of these is that if we're thinking about detection and decoding, the basis of these kinds of algorithms is usually some kinds of statistical inference problem, which depends on the statistics of the signal you observe. Another problem is resource allocation. So again, in this case, we may rely on resource allocation based on the channel capacity, for example. In this case, this will again depend on the kind of noise structure we have. And again, when we're talking about guaranteeing reliability and latency constraints, if we want to estimate what the probability of error, this again depends on the statistics of the signal you observe, and as a consequence, on the interference. Okay, so to try and formalize what's going on a little bit, if we consider a particular subnetwork here, so we'll have a receiver, for example, in the center of it, and this receiver will observe a signal, for example, from a desired device within its subnetwork. And so we'll call this RTI. So this is the desired signal at time t for receiver I. What we'll also have are probably some other devices within the network which are transmitting at the same time. And so this will also lead to an additional signal, and we can call this the intra-subnetwork interference. What we'll also have are signals which are received outside of the subnetwork, which we'll call the inter-subnetwork interference. And finally, we'll have this thermal noise. Now, the key point when we're dealing with these kind of subnetwork structures, as I mentioned before, typically we'll have a lot of channel state information, we'll know about the locations of devices, and we'll have control signaling which will be handled within the subnetwork. So by using techniques such as multi-user decoding, we typically can remove or at least significantly reduce this intra-subnetwork interference. But on the other hand, there's not too much control signaling between subnetworks. So we're left with this interference here, this inter-subnetwork interference. So effectively, when we observe after doing interference cancellation of the signals within the subnetwork, we'll be left with an effective received signal, which is the signal we want, plus this interference from outside of the subnetwork, plus this thermal noise. And so the basic question we have to ask at that point is, well, is there some way that we can mitigate this? Can we try and reduce this into subnetwork interference that we effectively have very little control over? Okay, so the basic challenge in managing this inter-subnetwork interference is the fact that we have very little information about how it's produced. And so, for example, we often won't know the locations of the transmitters, and we also won't have very much information about channel states. So these are things which the locations of transmitters, well, this is information that we would have to get, for example, through user identification or through transmission of specific location information. And channel state information would typically need to be obtained by pilot signaling. So this is a kind of control signaling which we don't have between these subnetworks. If this kind of information was available, then we can probably remove a lot of this inter-subnetwork interference using, for example, MIMO techniques or multi-user decoding, as we could for the intra-subnetwork interference. But in this case, because we don't have this information, we're really left with treating this inter-subnetwork interference as a kind of noise. Okay, so we know a lot about thermal noise. This has been something which has been studied for 100 years or more at this point. So we know that it can be well modeled by Gaussian statistics. And we use this fact a lot when we're designing algorithms for decoding data, for estimating the data rate we need to transmit, and so on. So all of these are based on the fact that we know that the thermal noise has Gaussian statistics. So if we want to ask these analogous kinds of questions when we're talking about this case where we have this interference and this noise, then the question we should be asking are, what are the interference statistics? So this is the basic question that I want to talk about for the rest of this presentation. So So before we go into trying to characterize exactly what's going on in this case where we don't have all this kinds of information, let's start with when can we approximate the interference with a Gaussian model. So let's suppose that the locations and channels of all the interferers are fixed. So there's some transmitters, interferers in the environment. Maybe we don't know exactly what the channels and the locations are, but they're fixed. If we use a standard model for the received signal that will be producing the transmitted signals which will be producing this interference, well, we'll have a sum which will be over all the interferers that are in this, that are creating this interference. We'll have some kind of small scale fading term, this H, and we'll have a distance between the interferer and the receiver, this R. This will involve some kind of path loss, so this is why this eta is appearing there. And finally, we'll have the data, which this interferer is sending to its desired receiver. So, as I said, if these two quantities, these H and these R's, are fixed, then the only source of randomness in this model is the data. Now, we know that if we're dealing with a point-to-point transmission, for example, in Gaussian noise, then what we would like is a signal which approximates a Gaussian input. So, what that means is that this interference here, under the assumption that these quantities are fixed, this will be governed by a Gaussian model. So effectively, the only randomness is the data, which we're saying is Gaussian. Okay, so conditioned on the locations and channels, our interference could be modeled as a Gaussian random variable. Okay, so now what we want to do is relax these conditions a little bit. So, as I mentioned, the Gaussian interference is arising from this assumption that the locations and the channels of all of these transmitting devices are fixed. So the first question we can ask, if we're trying to move towards the reality, is what happens when not all of the interferers are active at a particular time t. So a very simple model of this is just to suppose we have some network of interferers, which is fixed. They have fixed channels, they have fixed distances, and the only thing that's that's random in this particular model is the data that they send, and also whether or not they're active. And so we can associate to each transmitter a probability P. Okay, so this kind of setting is something we can experimentally study. So this is what we did in Lyon. We're lucky to have the Cortex lab, so you can see some of our colleagues posing in this testbed. So this is based in a basement underneath our laboratory with a bunch of USRPs. Okay, so what we can do is we can have a bunch of USRPs which are randomly selected to be on or off, and we'll have a receiver somewhere and measure the received signal. So if we do this, then we can plot the probability that we have interference larger than some value. So this figure is not quite that. What we're doing instead is looking at the log of the probability the interference is larger than some value versus the log of that value. So this is done so we can focus on large values of interference, which wouldn't appear in the Gaussian model. So in blue here, we have the Gaussian model. So what we see is that the log of the probability that this interference is large decays very quickly. And so this is not so surprising. We know that the tails of a Gaussian random variable in its density function decay exponentially. On the other hand, in the red curve, we have the experimental data. So the basic point here is that this decays quite slowly, roughly linearly in the case that we have, or at least in this particular regime, in this log-log scale. But the basic point here is that the Gaussian model is not good. We should probably ask why that is the case. Okay, so it turns out that an explanation for this phenomena is that when we introduce this random selection of transmitters, effectively what we're doing is we're producing a signal which forms a Gaussian mixture. So if we conditioned on the particular devices that are active, then the only thing that would be random would be the data again. So we'd have a Gaussian model. So the fact that we end up with that we're randomly selecting different subsets of interferers, well, that leads to a Gaussian mixture model. And this is effectively what's causing the phenomena we're observing here. And that's because even if the average variance of this model happens to be fitted to a standard Gaussian, what we'll still see is that we'll have components which have much larger variance. So with some probability, we'll have realizations of interferers with very high variance. And so this will lead us with higher probability to lead to these very high or these large values of the interference. Okay, so this is what I've just talked about now is a very simple model of how introducing some kinds of uncertainty into the interference, into how it's produced, can lead to a departure from a Gaussian model. And in particular, when we're just looking at which devices are transmitting, we lead to a Gaussian mixture model. Okay, but we can go a step further. And so we can talk about uncertainty in the channel state information. And in particular, we can talk about uncertainty in transmitter locations. So one common model of this kind of situation is that we assume that the interfering devices, their locations form a Poisson point process. So what we can think about is that these interferers are randomly placed on the plane. So it turns out that when we do this, then the interference that we observed so if we put a receiver at the origin, for example, then the signals that we receive from all of these interferers, it will not be governed by a Gaussian Gaussian distribution. In fact, what it turns out is that it's governed by something else. It's called a symmetric alpha stable distribution. So one way of thinking about this, without showing how exactly it arises, is that these kinds of models can be written as a product of two random variables. So one is a Gaussian random variable, and another one is this square root of A. And so it doesn't matter exactly what this is. It's actually, this A is a skewed alpha stable random variable, but for the purposes of today, it doesn't really matter exactly what this is. The important point is that when we have the product of two random variables, what we know is the density will be the convolution of their densities. And so we can think of this convolution as a kind of mixture. So when we have this uncertainty in these locations, what we end up with is a model where we have a scale mixture or we can think of it roughly as a Gaussian mixture with an infinite number of components. Okay, so just to say, so one way of thinking about these symmetric alpha stable models is through the scale mixture representation. So this kind of infinite Gaussian mixture model. Another way of thinking about it is through its probability density function. So this is actually quite complicated to write down. It doesn't have a closed form. In fact, how you talk about these alpha stable models is through their characteristic function. But there's a very interesting or very important feature of these models, and that's their tail behavior of their probability density function. So what I've plotted here are three different models. These are the probability density functions of three different models. In black, we have the Gaussian model, and in red and green and red and blue, we have two other alpha stable models. So what we see is that with the Gaussian model, the tails decay very rapidly, and in fact exponentially fast. But in with these other values of alpha, these tail decay, in fact, like a polynomial. So what this is capturing is the fact that the probability of having a large level of interference is much higher for these alpha stable models than for this Gaussian one, which also happens to be a stable model, but for a value of 2. Okay, so what we also did in relation to this is to do a larger scale verification of this model. So I showed you these experimental results from the Cortex lab, which was this small number of USRPs and where we were randomly selecting them. Well, we also got in touch with a group in Aalborg who'd done some very nice experiments where they collected signals around 868 megahertz in the Aalborg region. So these are results from a shopping area in Aalborg. So this is a plot which is very similar to the one I showed you before. This log of S of x is just a log of the probability the interference is larger than some value. And over here we have the log of the interference value. So what we see is we have our Gaussian model again, which again is decaying very rapidly. What we have in the heavy shading is the real experimental data. And what we have around this are alpha stable models for some different values of alpha. And so these, what this shows is that clearly these are better models than the Gaussian one. These are capturing these, this fact that the data has a much higher probability of having large interference than the Gaussian model predicts. Okay, so what I hope I've shown so far is that Gaussian models in reality don't reflect the true distribution of interference in practical systems. And where this is coming from is really the fact that we have a lot of uncertainty about the devices which are generating this interference. So whether they're active or not, whether they have, what their particular location is and what their channel state information is. Okay, so given that that's the fact, we should probably ask the next question, which is, well, so what? Does it change anything, the fact that that we might have this kind of interference? So an initial initial question we can ask is, well, what is the capacity of a channel which has this kind of noise? So if we imagine the classical problem of looking at the capacity of a Gaussian noise channel, so what this means is that we have some output Y, our input X, and we have some noise which is Gaussian. So if we put this power constraint on our input, then a very well-known result due to Shannon is that our capacity has this form. So we have this half log 1 plus SNR effectively. So this result has been very important for a lot of different reasons. One, of course, was to understand what the limits of channel coding was. But another application that's common is for rate adaptation and also for resource allocation. So if we're doing power control, for example, this is often based on these kinds of quantities. So the problem we want to ask now is, well, what happens if we have alpha stable noise? So it turns out that the capacity is not the same. So one of the results we established a couple of years ago is a characterization, so upper and lower bounds on this capacity. So this expression is a little bit complicated. So let me just show a picture. So here what we see is the capacity of this kind of channel with a particular parameter for the noise, but different values of the alpha. So when we're making this alpha lower, we're effectively making it further away from a Gaussian model. So the closer alpha is to 2, the closer, in some sense, you can think about it as a Gaussian model. So what we see, the general trend here is that as we reduce the alpha, we make it further away from the Gaussian model. The capacity tends to drop, keeping the other parameters the same. What we can also see is that these bounds are reasonably close, and what we see is that the numerical evaluation of the capacity, so through the Blaud-Aramoto algorithm, lies in between them. Another interesting observation is that the capacity asymptotically, when we make the power large, it looks like half log plus p plus a constant. So this is consistent with the behavior of the capacity of a Gaussian channel. Okay, so just to quickly, so I'll end in a few minutes. So what I've been talking about so far has been really related to point-to-point communication over a single subcarrier, if you like, over a single frequency band. But quite often when we're doing transmissions, even in IoT kinds of situations, we use a number of orthogonal resources. So typically this is in the form of multiple subcarriers. So for example, if we're using some modulation scheme such as OFDM. So the basic idea here is that what we were doing before is saying, let's consider a single subcarrier. We'll have some interference from a number of different interferers, and the total interference will be the sum of this. What we want to consider now in this kind of situation is instead a vector of interference. So this will be associated to a vector of observations, which are coming from each of these different subcarriers. So for example, the interference coming from the third line may come from this third subcarrier, and would be the sum of the total contributions of all the devices that happen to be utilizing it. So in general, not all devices will be using all subcarriers. They'll only use a subset of them. And so this is what this gray is indicating. Okay, so if we want to account for this kind of model, what we need to do is instead look at random vector models for our interference rather than random variables. And so if we're going from this scalar case, these alpha stable models with these heavy tails that I've been talking about through the whole work, what we need to look at is random vectors with heavy tails. So based on what we've seen before, probably what we want to do is keep the marginals. So each element of our random vector should have something that looks like an alpha stable distribution. But an important note, which happens to occur quite often, is that the interference on different subcarriers, so these different elements in our interference vector, they may not be independent. And so what we need to describe is not only what the distribution of each element of a random vector will be, but also the dependence between them. And so capturing this dependence is actually a fairly non-trivial problem. So there's a few different ways we can think about doing it. It turns out there's a multivariate extension of the alpha stable model. And again, it's not so easy to characterize or work with. In fact, it's given by its characteristic function, and it depends on a spectral measure. So a measure on the sphere in however many dimensions we're working in. Another approach that we've looked at is using certain kinds of statistical models, which are called copular models. So just to summarize a few other things that we did in relation to this model. So when we're talking about these multivariate noise models, well, what this means is that we have vector observations. So a natural thing you can do when you're talking about detection or data decoding is combining of this information. And a common approach to do this is through linear combining. So we analyzed this kind of setup with a certain family of multivariate alpha stable models in one work. I also extended some of the results I presented earlier in the case where we had a single subcarrier on the capacity. So now we're looking at not scalar channels, but vector channels. And we can also talk about the capacity of these kinds of channels from this information theoretic point of view. And we can also think about looking at other kinds of problems, such as decoding of channel codes. So we know, for example, that if you're decoding an LDPC code, what you care about is a likelihood ratio. And this likelihood ratio, this depends on the distribution of the noise. So we can think about modifying channel code decoding strategies by taking into account information we have about the noise. So there's a number of quite interesting and still somewhat mysterious features to these kinds of problems. So for example, this is a plot of the capacity in the case where we have multivariate interference, or we're dealing with a vector channel. And this is the case where we have an alpha stable random vector, which does not have independent elements. And so an interesting phenomenon, though, is that it turns out that using an isotropic Gaussian input, so this means a Gaussian input with independent elements, works pretty well. So whether this is something which generalizes or not is still somewhat of an open problem. Okay, so to conclude, when we're thinking about large-scale networks, a very common assumption is that the interference is Gaussian, but in fact, we can verify this a number of ways, and particularly through experiments. It's not actually Gaussian. And what we found is that there's a theoretically principled family of models known as alpha stable models, which are also quite flexible and are consistent with real-world data. But when we're moving away from these kinds of Gaussian models, there's a number of implications. So one of these is that for example, the channel capacity changes, and this has implications for all kinds of aspects of the design. So whether this is rate adaptation or power control. And what we've also been looking at is multivariate interference models, which are arising from these settings where we're doing frequency division multiplexing and utilizing multiple subcarriers. And in this setting, we've looked at some information theoretic limits. Thank you.
Long live India and France friendship.